Welcome to Algebra 1, Classifying Polynomials. In this video, we are going to classify polynomials by the number of terms and degree, but we're also going to determine if an expression is a polynomial, then name it based on degree and number of terms, and then write the polynomial in standard form and also identify leading coefficients. These are the standards that we're going to cover in this video. These are the Florida's Best Standards for Mathematics. So let's go ahead and get started, and let's start with what a polynomial is and isn't. So a polynomial is an expression with one or more terms. And so let's give some non-examples. So a variable in a radical. So we can't have something like negative 3x squared plus 2x minus the square root of x. That square root of x automatically makes it not a polynomial. We also cannot have negative exponents, and we kind of talked about this a little bit in exponents, that we didn't want them to be negative, and so we were always changing them into fractions and moving things into the numerator or denominator. And so you cannot have something like 45x to the negative third. Okay, so we can't have any negative exponents. And then that also means that we can't have variables in the denominator. So we know that x to the negative third would push that x into the denominator. And so we can't have something like 9x squared plus 2 over x, and then even if that x had a 2 on it, we know that that would be a negative exponent, and we can't have that x in the bottom. All right, and then we can't have variables as exponents. So you can't have something like 3 to the x power plus 5. And then we cannot have fractional exponents. So we know that those fractional exponents create those radicals, right? And so we can't have something like 2x to the 1/2, because now that 1/2 created the same as what we had up here. Okay, we can't have that x in the radical. All right, let's move on into how we classify polynomials by the number of terms. So first you need to know what terms are. And so terms in an expression are separated by the addition and the subtraction signs. So when we are thinking about only having one term, that could be something like 2x. We could have 2x plus something, right? And so that 2x would just be one term by itself. So it can be a combination of numbers and variables that are connected through multiplication. It could just be a constant, so something like -5, or a variable by itself. So it could be something like y, okay? And then we could also put exponents on those. And so we could have something like 3y squared. Any one of those would be classified as a monomial. Mono means one, and so there's only one term if we only have 2x or -5 or y or 3y squared. That's only one term. So two terms means that we would be combining them using an addition or subtraction sign, and there would be two of those. So something like 3x minus 2, or y squared plus y, and that would be called a binomial. And then three terms, same thing. And so we could have something like x squared plus 2x minus 3. That would be three terms, and that's called a trinomial. So it gets a little confusing because when we think poly, we think more than one, but monomials are polynomials. And then usually they say monomial, binomial, and then anything that's three or more, most people will call it a polynomial. But don't get those confused. All of these are polynomials, okay? All right, classifying polynomials by the degree. So when we are looking at these, if we have the first degree means that we have something to the power of 1. So x shows up somewhere, or a variable shows up somewhere. And so we're talking about adding up the exponents within each term. And so the terms with the highest exponent sum is your degree. And we're talking about the exponents of variables. This is very important. Okay, so if I have something like 3x plus 5, the highest degree that I have is that first degree. And so if it's a first degree, that's called linear. Okay, and we've seen that in y equals mx plus b, right? We have x to that first power. For the second, that would be something like 2x squared plus 8. Okay, so we have x to the second degree. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. So even when you're doing practice, if you have something like negative 3x a b, that would also be to the second degree because we're going to add the 1 on the a and add the 1 on the b, and that gives us 2. Okay, and so when we're naming this, it's called quadratic. Now, when the only variable that you have is x, that's where we're talking about linear equations or quadratic equations. Linear equations are going to look like this. Quadratic equations create that smiley face or frowny face. But obviously, if we have something like AB, that's not going to create one of those lines because we would be talking about x's and y's. All right, so classifying polynomials, third degree, that is going to be called cubic. And so if you only have x's, we could have something like 3x to the third plus 2x squared minus x minus 5. No matter what, the highest degree that I have is that 3. And so that's going to be cubic. And you're going to learn more about cubic functions in Algebra 2. They're going to look kind of wavy, kind of something like that. And then for fourth degrees, that's going to be quartic. And then fifth degree is going to be quintic. And then they really don't call it anything after that, to be honest. I'm sure they have names, but we're not going to worry about that in Algebra 1. All right, and then there's something else I want you to take note of. So let's say we have just negative 5, right? So if we just had negative 5, there is no x on it, right? If we were to add an x on there, it would be to the 0 power because we didn't see it. And so if we just have something like negative 5, that's going to be called a constant. And so that's going to have a 0 degree, and it's called a constant. And that's why we've been calling numbers that don't have variables constants this entire time. And that means that it's just going to be a horizontal line on a graph, it's not doing anything else. Okay? Alrighty. So now let's talk briefly about how to write polynomials in standard form. And this is something that we've already kind of been doing, but now we're just going to touch on it and focus on it for a little bit. So for this one, we see that the highest degree is a 2. So I'm just going to write this out to the side. My degree is going to be a 2. And if we go back here, that means that this is going to be a quadratic. And so we would call this quadratic. And then if I go back here, if I'm looking at my number of terms, I see that I have 1 term, 2 terms, and 3 terms. And so that's going to be a trinomial. Okay, so when you're doing your practice, it's often going to ask you for all 3 of these things. All right, and then now let's get it into standard form. So for standard form, you're going to put the highest exponent first. So it's going to be 5x squared, and then you want to go in descending order. So I see that 3x, and then our constant is always going to be last. And so we've been writing it like this, but now we're going to do some extra practice. Now, the leading coefficient is the coefficient of the first term when the expression is written in standard form. So my leading coefficient is going to be that 5. So leading coefficient for this one is going to be 5. All right, let's try with this other one. So with this other one, I see that the highest exponent is that 3. So I'm going to go ahead and write this in standard form first. And notice that my 3y squared, that would be my second highest, has that negative in front. I want to make sure that my signs out in front of my terms are remaining the same. Then I have plus 3y. And then remember, those constants are always going to be last because they have a degree of 0. And now let's talk about degree. So degree is going to be 3. And then if we go back, our third degree is going to be cubic. And then when we look at the number of terms we have, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 terms. And so that is going to we're just going to call that a polynomial. So we normally say monomial, binomial, trinomial, and then anything more than that, we're just going to say polynomial. Just know that if you are taking a test, they may even call a trinomial just a polynomial. That's often the case. And then from here, let's think about our leading coefficient. So our leading coefficient is the coefficient of that first term. And so our leading coefficient is going to be -1. So don't remember that there's a little 1 in there. And so our leading coefficient is -1. And that wraps up our video on classifying polynomials by degree, by the number of terms, and how we can name these polynomials. And then we also covered standard form. Whenever you're working on a test, anytime you have multiple choice, or if you're having to type in your answer, you're always going to see it in standard form usually, or you're going to want to type it into standard form to make sure that it's getting graded correctly. So just keep that in mind.